Well, I'm Nick Redding. I'm with Preservation Maryland, and we're excited to be talking with Charlotte Davis of the Rural Maryland Council. And we're going to be talking with her about the big opportunity with electric vehicles, EVs, and a symposium that's being put together by a number of different groups, including the Rural Maryland Council, Preservation Maryland, Beach to Bay, Heritage Areas, and others coming up this February. And we'll give all those details, and we'll be here in the links as well. But before we get started, Charlotte, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where'd you grow up? Are you a lifelong Marylander? And then tell us about the Rural Maryland Council.
So I am. I'm originally from Western Maryland, grew up in a place called Sharpsburg, Antietam, a graduate of Washington County Public Schools. And then I'm a graduate of University of Maryland, so go Terps. And my graduate degree in political communications is from Johns Hopkins. I've been executive director of the Rural Maryland Council for 10 years. And we are an independent state agency. We're located in the Maryland Department of Agriculture. And our mission is that we convene federal, state, local, elected, appointed officials, private citizens to identify the challenges in rural areas. We administer 2 grant programs, the Maryland Agriculture Education and Rural Development Assistance Fund and the Rural Maryland Prosperity Investment Fund. And we also advocate before Congress, U.S. Congress, the General Assembly, and we're going to be moving into doing some more research related to rural issues so that we can be able to provide more information, academic information to policymakers, legislators, appointed officials.
So the question some might ask immediately is, why does the Rural Maryland Council care about electric vehicles? So you just gave us sort of the background on who the Rural Maryland Council is, and a lot of it kind of makes obvious sense: broadband and making sure people have access to things that they need in rural areas, whether that be healthcare or infrastructure or things like that. So where do electric vehicles fall in all of this, and why is it even a priority?
Well, there's 2 issues. One is we want to make sure that as we are transitioning transportation to electric vehicles, that our rural areas are able to have the electric infrastructure that they need to generate, support tourism, support place-based development, so that the folks that are looking to travel into areas of the state, that if they need to stop and charge up, that, hey, there's this beautiful cultural park, a cultural place, a park, amenity that we could attract people to come into the community, charge up their vehicles, but hey, see what, other parts of the state have to offer in terms of, cultural attractions. We've got great parks. And so just trying to encourage tourists and people traveling to stop in our rural areas. And then transportation is just a challenge across all the rural areas. So we are very car dependent. But we're also, because of our nature of being rural, we're dispersed. We're often far apart from places. So range envy is definitely, that anxiety related to, can I have a vehicle that can get me to this place, is real. And we want to help facilitate that and ease people's minds that now, if you come to a rural area, if you live, and we want to encourage people who live in rural areas to transition to an EV vehicle. There's a lot of incentives to do so. So we want to try to encourage and assist all our rural areas to take advantage of the opportunities that the federal and state government are providing for.
And so, and that's kind of in a sense what's bringing this all to a head, because obviously people have been talking about electric vehicles for a while. We are seeing many more on the road, but maybe talk to people about what it is that's kind of triggering it at this point, which is there's these huge federal funding opportunities and money coming down the road, so to speak, right, that are going to make an opportunity not only for urban areas but for rural areas as well. And so is that in a sense what's kind of bringing this all together at this moment?
Yes, we are expecting, so as part of the federal legislation, I think it was the infrastructure bill last year, contained the state of Maryland is going to receive $63 million to build out our electric car infrastructure. So we are expecting to see a request for proposals from the Maryland Department of Transportation at the end of February of 2023. They've sent out a request for information in October, so we kind of know what they're looking at. And so we want to help prepare and support our rural communities, the folks that have an interest in this, to be prepared and ready to apply for that grant application once those funds become available.
So it's a huge opportunity for the entire state, huge opportunity for rural Maryland. When you talk about sort of this range envy, the idea that, you know, somebody wants to go on the Harriet Tubman Byway, but they're worried that when they get, you know, out into Blackwater or they get to the Harriet Tubman Visitor Center, they have no battery charge left. And then how do they get back to Cambridge, or how do they get back to Easton, or how do they get back to DC? And so we want to have this network of places that ties all that together. We've sort of talked about it in this sense of cultural infrastructure. So there's the infrastructure of the actual cultural, historic, recreational sites, but then there's the infrastructure that goes along with it. And sometimes we think about that in terms of, you know, maybe a gas station, maybe food along the way, things like that. But more and more, we also have to have places to charge these vehicles to get people out into the rural areas. So that's sort of the big need. There's money coming down that groups are going to be kind of working to kind of get in a position to be able to secure some of those funds to help distribute it to rural areas. I know Preservation Maryland and others in the Heritage Area Program are going to be working on that, certainly in partnership with the Rural Maryland Council, which has been a leader on all of these issues. I mean, tying together broadband and providing rural health care and all those sorts of things. There's probably not an issue in rural Maryland that you guys haven't touched and haven't impacted positively. So it's exciting to see you guys involved in this because electric vehicles are a big issue. And so because of all of these exciting things that are happening, groups have come together and coalesced around pulling together this symposium. Because when nonprofits and businesses and municipalities care about something, they create a symposium. So we are doing a symposium all together on Monday, February 13th from 9 to 2. And it's the Power to Go Symposium. Love it. So where is it? What's going to be happening there? And who are the kind of folks who should be attending something like this?
So we're, you mentioned February 13th. It's a Monday, 9 to 2 at the Chesapeake Bay Environmental Center in Grasonville. Queen Anne's County, just across the bridge on the Eastern Shore. We have invited Gabe Klein, who's the executive director of US DOT, who's done a lot of work in EV infrastructure across the country, to come be the keynote speaker. And then we'll be looking to bring in policy experts to model, particularly looking at case studies across the state and in other states where it has worked for rural. We've got some folks from Frederick County, Montgomery County that have been successful in getting these charging stations hooked up. So hoping to learn from some of them, but then also bringing in the electric the utilities, because they need to be a part of this conversation as well. To make sure that they're on board to help support this kind of effort. And it's really about organizing and bringing everybody who's interested together. We find that collaboration and partnerships is how we have to make it work. So the more, the better. And it's going to be a mix of, we think stakeholders, community groups that want these, elected officials and appointed officials that are, in charge of things like permitting, where these go, and then the funding piece. How do we scrap together a coalition that can apply for these funds, leverage additional funding so that we can make these things, these stations sustainable into the future. We don't just want to put them in there. We want to make sure that people get to them and use them into the future.
And I mean, in some ways, it's obviously focused on the rural communities, but really anyone who has an interest in the future of EVs and how they impact communities, how they impact recreational, cultural, natural sites, would get something out of this. So even if you are in a sort of a more urbanized area, this would be a great opportunity. Because as far as I'm aware, I mean, there's been lots of conversations, but like in terms of an EV symposium in Maryland, this is one of the first. And I love that one of the first is being put together by the rural areas. I think in Maryland, uniquely, we have, and much to your credit, we have a really, I think, progressive and forward-thinking view on how our rural areas should develop, sort of respecting both the aesthetic and the culture of the rural areas, but also providing them the resources that make them competitive and make it a good place to live. And so I think the idea that the rural areas are leading the conversation about EVs is pretty exciting. And I think is a cool thing for the state. And I think for people in the region, even if you're in Pennsylvania or Delaware or Virginia, or the district, and you want to make your way out to this as well, there's an opportunity for that. So in the links below this conversation, we'll have ways for you to register to join us for that. And I'm curious what's next for the Rural Maryland Council. Obviously, people come to the event, they can learn more about RMC, get to meet you and your staff. But where are you guys headed next? We have a new gubernatorial administration, so you are within administratively the Department of Agriculture, and so what's the big focus kind of moving forward? Obviously, EVs, broadband, I'm sure still remains a priority. But what else should people be paying attention to when it comes to RMC?
We are looking at health and human services transportation, because like I said, transportation is a challenge in rural areas. It cuts across every industry sector, not just tourism and economic development, but employment, education, and healthcare. So we're looking at encouraging more transit. We think the model for rural transit needs to change from a less fixed route, big bus, to more on-demand, smaller vehicles, so thinking less of a traditional bus and more of an Uber type service is probably the way we need to go. So making sure that we're part of that conversation when we're talking about transit, because I find this misnomer that rural people don't want transit. And the fact is we absolutely do. We survey our membership every year. It comes up every year as a need. So we're hoping to work with this next administration to help better coordinate those funds. Basically right now for transit's every county for themselves. If they're big enough, they can operate their own system, of which I think 7 or 8 do, but the rest are too small and they generally contract that work out. So it's been a challenge for some of them. And we just find that the fixed routes are struggling. So we need to be a little more innovative in our approach to this. But we want to show that absolutely rural and transit needs to be a part of that conversation. And we'll be looking to help reestablish a coordinating committee on that to try and reinvigorate and braid in these services better with social service. Social determinants of health. We know 85% of your health outcomes determined by your socioeconomic class, and that a lot of that is relying on having a car. So if you don't have a car, you can't get anywhere.
Yeah. So it's fascinating, of course, sort of the historian and preservationist in the room. What's old is new again, as growing up in Western Maryland, used to be able to go from Emmitsburg in Frederick County to Brunswick on a trolley. And so if we still had our historic infrastructure, we probably wouldn't be even having this conversation. But unfortunately, we don't have that. Not sure if trolleys are on your list of things to look at, but I think it's fascinating. And I think people who live in rural areas, as I do, I think you're right. It's we want transit. Transit just looks a little different here because we don't have the numbers in order for people to do that. But moving people around is critically important. And obviously a part of this conversation that we're having about EVs, and probably a future conversation that we'll have about self-driving vehicles.
That's where I think we're going. And so we think part of this effort is why we want to build out the electric infrastructure. We also need to be building out the telecommunications infrastructure, broadband, because all those vehicles are going to need, they're going to need that communication, and they're going to need the charging too. So we feel this is the first step in that vision towards, we will get the self-driving cars at some point, but we're going to need that infrastructure in place to make it happen. And this could be that part. We could be leveraging resources today to make that happen in the future.
Well, if anyone didn't believe what I said about the Rural Maryland Council being a pretty progressive organization looking at the future of rural issues, this conversation probably cemented that fact, because I think when people think of rural areas, they're probably not thinking about autonomous vehicles, broadband, and EV charging. But that's exactly where the conversation is right now, because those are ways of making rural places sustainable, and places that people can continue to live and care for, and an exciting
You want to share it with the
conversation.
rest of the country too, with the rest of the state, but if you have an electric vehicle, you're not going to come because you can't charge your car. So we
Yeah.
want to invite those people. Hopefully you'll come see the great stuff that we've got to offer in rural Maryland.
So if you've enjoyed this little teaser of the conversation, we're going to go much more in depth on February 13th. The information will all be here for people to register. And we'll have all that information, continue to share it, as well as links to the Rural Maryland Council, where you get to meet them and learn a little bit more about what they do. Charlotte, thanks so much for joining us today. We're looking forward to seeing you in Grasonville on the 13th of February.
Thank you for having me.